Okay, we will take things up again, this time in English. And I already announced you a tiny little change for after lunch. We reversed the two talks that will be just after lunch. So it will be Hans-Jörg Heinberger first and then Hélène Mialet. Okay, just in case someone needs to know. But now, first, I'm really happy to have Christopher Kelty. Christopher Kelty is a professor at the University of California in Los Angeles at the Institute for Society and Genetics, but also the Department of Anthropology, but also the Department of Information Studies. So as you can see, he is quite interdisciplinary, the incarnation of interdisciplinarity, I guess. He's the director of the Levesco Initiative of Neuronarrative and Artificial Intelligence, and one of the co-directors of the C5 Future Flourishing, together with Hélène Mialet, which is a very impressive research program, if ever anyone can get it. I think it's an interesting thing to have. He has, as he writes in his description of himself, authored 2 bits, but the bits are actually books, I guess. One of them is called The Cultural Significance of Free Software. It was published in 2008. And the other one, A Century of Participation in 4 Stories, published in 2019. And he's currently, and I guess what he's going to present to us is part of this project, working also in a project that is called the Labyrinth Project, a multidisciplinary collaborative research inquiry into conflicts and controversy in urban ecologies in Los Angeles. The floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup, Catherine, Didier, à la ULB. OK. Il faut que nous lançons cette enquête avec les faits. Et le premier fait, c'est que je ne parle pas français du tout. Je suis complètement désolé, mais comme le tour a dit, peut-être jamais, les faits sont les faits. Okay, so, in English. So it's possible, since I don't speak French, and I've realized now that I've been listening for a day and a half, I might not also speak Latour anymore. I've been very impressed with my colleagues' ability, their facility with the language of the inquiry into the modes of existence, and maybe a little concerned for their mental health as well. So I suppose I'm a bit like the Quebecois speaker in Paris, right? Bringing a Latour that I know from an American context into a context. But I've decided I will try and play along with this project. I'm not going to present anything here that will recognizably be a contribution to philosophy, but I hope to demonstrate what it means to do empirical work with Latour as one's guide, as he's been my guide for many decades at this point. Along with a number of other people in science studies. I really sort of started in the 1990s with Latour, with Donna Haraway, with Hans-Jörg Reinberger, even with Isabel Stingers of an earlier generation. And so I will try to demonstrate a little bit how the project that's unfolded, that I'll talk about here today, really owes a tremendous amount to that. Yesterday, John Tresh gave us a really wonderful rundown of the problem of multiple ontologies and the challenge of multiplying modes of existence, and especially the role of composition. And I come to this topic with a particular question of composition, which is, what does it mean to bring animals into politics? And this is a question I can very clearly imagine Latour asking, and probably did ask. What does it mean to compose animals as political subjects or agents? It's something that Latour, and more directly Donna Haraway, has urged us to do. They're far from alone in doing so. Outside our small gathering here, the question of whether animals have political rights, how they might express them, whether they have autonomy, agency, or voice, these are questions that fill volumes. Like the beings and phenomena that we heard about from Fanny and Catherine yesterday, they're disqualified beings, but entities very much in the process of being constantly requalified. In fact, I was really quite taken by John's suggestion of a gallery of super existences, and I thought I might propose what I think is probably a very unlikely candidate for the gallery, namely the administrative state of the United States government. And I don't mean the government. I don't mean the democratic system. I mean the deep state, as they say in the Republican Party these days. I mean the bureaucracy and the amazing mess that is administration in the US. And I'll say more about why I think this is interesting and how it relates to animals shortly. But in Latourian terms, I think the administrative state is where multiple modes of existence come together and their boundaries, overlaps, or superexistence must be produced and managed. And my suggestion is that this process is one of the sites where it's clearest that animals become political actors. So just a little overview of the talk. I want to give a little bit of detail about the Labyrinth Project, which is the project that, that a lot of the research you'll see today has generated. I want to give a definition of what I mean by agencies of animal governance and maybe try out a few ways in which it might connect to multiple modes of existence. And then I want to bring you to California, and I think landing on Earth is something I also learned from Latour. It means you have to land in a specific place, so we're going to land in California. And then I want to give you several cosmograms of Los Angeles that I've been creating as part of this research, and return at the end to this question of modes or superexistences and the question of the administrative state. We'll see whether or not I can do any of those things, but hopefully at least it will be enjoyable. Okay, so the Labyrinth Project is a very capacious project that I've been running for about 10 years now that has a wide variety of different kinds of research projects in it. It's a kind of sprawling project focused on animals and ecologies in Los Angeles. It's funded for the time being by the National Science Foundation, though any day that could end at this point, back to the administrative state of the United States. It has about a dozen projects investigating time and space of animal and ecological life in LA, both historical and anthropological, sometimes ecological as well. It has an archive that we're developing, an audio documentary series. I suppose we call those podcasts now, but it's more than that. We're also designing a game, and we're also a kind of factory for undergraduate research, because it's the UCLA is a very, very large public university, so a lot of people have participated in this over the years. And so much of what you'll see is collaborative research, not just mine. People ask how I got to this project because these two books that Katrine mentioned that I've written are not at all about animals, ecologies, Los Angeles, or any of those things. And one of the ways in which I got into this story is just one of those wonderful ways in which you fall into field work. And a colleague of mine wanted to start doing research on mammals in Los Angeles. She was a biological anthropologist, and so she asked me as a cultural anthropologist to join. And she said she wanted to understand what people thought about animals in Los Angeles. And I think most people who live in cities don't think about animals. So I said, let's talk to people who actually know something about animals in the city instead. And my first intuition was to go and study the work of people who are pest control professionals. And this turned out to be a really great choice, because pest control professionals have a very particular way of seeing animals in a city. So these are images of one of the first people I worked with teaching me how to set up a coyote snare to catch coyotes in the city. I thought for sure that was what we were going to be doing through most of this time. And so I went out with them on ride-alongs, and the first day I was very excited, kind of like the anthropologist with the hunters out in Siberia, right? To go looking for coyotes and catch one with a snare. But instead we spent 12 hours filling little black boxes with poison in order to kill rats. So here we are filling little black boxes with poison in order to kill rats. But both of these things turned out to be extremely interesting ways of getting into the way how animals are governed in cities. So let me try out a couple of definitions here on you. The question of how to bring animals into politics, for me, has an answer that starts with a play on words in English. The agencies of animal governance are both those agencies of the state, organizations with names like the California Fish and Wildlife Department or the United States Department of Agriculture, and those agencies that animals possess, like a keen sense of smell, and an ability to migrate long distances, an ability to or the ability to tolerate the presence of humans. Let's see here, I can play this while I'm... these two agencies come together when, as happened in August of 2024 in Mammoth Lakes, California, the California Fish and Wildlife Department decided to euthanize a bear because it determined that it was behaving erratically when it swiped a human woman and injured her at a campsite. So this is actually the Facebook video of that bear. And I'm actually going to stop it before the swipe. You could just imagine it. This bear was named Victor, and eventually Victor had to be euthanized by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. So multiple agencies claim responsibility for bears. There's a ton of them: the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, the Mammoth Lakes Police Department, the U.S. Forest Service, the National Park Service, but also the Bishop Paiute, Inyo, and Mono County officials, the Bishop Paiute Tribe, the Fish and Game Commission, Wildlife Resources Committee. There's a lot of them. All of these agencies have some stake in governing what happens to bears. And it really depends on what the bear is doing and where the bear is. But agencies, in the sense of what bears can do, is the subject of a lot of diverse contestation. How they reproduce, how they den, their predation, what they eat, whether they're attracted to particular scents, whether they can open supposedly bear-proof boxes, where they go, they're tracked by GPS collars, etc., where they can be relocated. But also how they are relating to humans and other animals. Whose kin are they? How do they relate to humans? What do they do? Above all, how do you tell the difference between what a bear is, a bear in the species sense, and this bear here, Victor, right? When does something go wrong with an individual bear? This is the site of the most intense contestation right now, is treating animals as individuals and discovering that their individual differences can be the subject of inquiry that is both scientific and ethical and practical, sometimes moral and religious as well. Victor was known to be very tolerant of human, crafty and curious, until one day he wasn't. So when government agencies and animal agencies come together, it's a site of transformation and mixing. I would like to say that in the practical action of government agencies, dealing with animals is where multiple modes of existence overlap and mingle. I don't know how stable they are. I don't know where their boundaries are. In fact, if I have something valuable to learn from people in this meeting, it is to help me think with Latour about how to identify where these modes of existence are appearing and how they're mixing. When government and animal agencies come together, it's a site often of rationality and scientific inquiry, but it's also a site of political participation. The California Department of Fish and Wildlife, like any agency, has a public participation process, solicits comments from people, engages the public in various ways, as well as employing scientists and engineers whose job it is to study the agencies of bears. It bears saying, no pun intended, that the agencies I'm talking about here are also organizations. They're not branches of government per se, or laws or statutes or elected leaders, but they contain elements of all of these things. They contain, they kind of reproduce the three branches of government in this so-called fourth branch in the deep state, these agencies. And there are actually about 3 million different people working at the federal level in the American administrative state. And that each of those is replicated in each of the 50 states, right? So it's a really massive bureaucracy, and people don't understand it as such. It's also, right now, under tremendous attack by the current president, right? It's an attack that's focused on trying to dismantle that state, to delegitimate it, which is a weird and somewhat Pyrrhic quest, because it is so large that it's really hard to do much damage to it. But he's doing a good job of it right now. So, but when it comes to animals, the situation is even more complex than just being governed by the administrative state, because there's a range of private actors who see it as their duty to govern animals. And that ranges from individuals to, as I mentioned, tribal and sovereign governments that are within the United States, to private organizations like humane societies or environmental activists. So you have a kind of range and mess of people whose job who have taken it upon themselves to govern animals and to make them into political actors in different ways. So this is a kind of definition then of what I think happens in this setting. And in this milieu of governance, animals are made and made into political subjects. And so let me try and hazard just this definition first, and then I'll give you a tour of the cosmograms, and maybe it will make sense and we can return to it. But To become a political subject of governance implies, first of all, some mechanism of contestation, some way of being able to say, we're not going to be governed like that. Governance without the capacity for contestation is an abrogation of popular sovereignty. Even so, governance with the capacity for contestation, but without a predictable response, is a kind of arbitrary domination. It does not it's not necessarily that governance includes the contestation, right? But that the contestants are capable of some kind of political agency with respect to it. And I'm playing along here by thinking about how in each part of this definition some of these modes of existence might be more or less present. When animals appear to agencies, when they become visible to agencies, it happens primarily through the intercession of humans who diagnose those relations with animals as particular kinds of problems. Over time, this can develop into a form of relation with animals that's structured and systematic, a response to problems which in some ways may or may not still be problems. Killing rats actually has this structure. We created a problem that we now have tried to solve that may or may not still be a problem. And it becomes institutionalized maybe as a habit of the agency or just as something that's built into that organizational structure. A lot of the things that go on under here involve, as I say, sciences of ecology and behavioral genetics and stuff, but also the incorporation of public perspectives on these things, or tribal consultations, which are sometimes required by law, or economic and agricultural issues that are brought to bear on this. But also fiction issues like the centrality of certain kinds of animals. Eagles and horses in America, for instance, have a different status as fictive entities and therefore as practical entities than other things. When an agency responds with respect to some sort of agency that an animal is understood to possess, it usually takes the form of knowledge about agencies that some expert has provided, scientific, behavioral, ecological, etc. And those are the ones that are most common in cities. In more rural areas, people associated with living on the land differently, this is likely to also include the knowledge and practices of farmers, ranchers, native inhabitants, nomads, or others who tend the land and its entities. So these attributed agencies, whether they're attributed by scientists or by other people who work the land, represent the entire field of attempts to make sense of the capacities that animals have, the ways humans can experience or register them, and the ways humans have developed to communicate with, respond to, or counteract such agencies. So I think it goes without saying, but our definition of politics is generally not extended to animals precisely because they lack speech, right? This is the sort of core problem of political theory when you want to bring animals into it. However, my argument here is that there's a very wide range of capacities that are given to these animals and then interpreted as some kind of response to an action, right? And these are not always explicitly understood as political, obviously, so I'm pushing it in that direction to say you have to see it as a political response when someone says, when we put a fence around this area and the coyote goes into it again, it's a kind of contestation, right? And the scientist might argue, no, that's just what wolves do, there's a sheep on the other side, but there's also a way in which the coyote or the mountain lion is contesting something there, and people see that as something they have to then deal with. Now, when animals respond in this form by contesting, it's often difficult for humans to make sense of it. In many cases, it's simply interpreted as a failure of control, an agency that attempts to keep animals off pastures, for instance. But it's not regularly read as a form of political contestation. So a rancher might shift, as it were, modes of existence in order to appeal to a deity for a recompense, right? The sheep that was taken, it becomes a religious issue of sacrifice, as opposed to a governmental one of killing the wolf, right? One can see these kinds of shifts happening regularly. But the capacity to actually negotiate with wolves or coyotes, which is to say the fence, the gun, the interpretation of the coyote's behavior, these are utterly limited tools in this political context right now, right? And so I think it's very interesting to try and approach exactly how it is that animals are read as contesting or may actually be contesting certain kinds of activities. Animals also respond, however, with agencies that overflow what any particular agency expects of an animal. and animals' capacities are only as obvious to humans as the work they put into understanding them. So animals always do things that people are surprised by, and that kind of overflow is a moment that can either be taken as an opportunity to learn more, or as just the end of a story. Okay, so let me take you then to California and talk to you a little bit about the various ways in which animals are governed, primarily in cities. But one of the things about doing work on urban animals is to recognize that an urban ecology is not just an urban place, and it's not also an accident that it's an ecology. It fits within a particular place. And I've been actually quite taken with Latour's insistence that we land on Earth in particular places, and want to take seriously that if one does that, one has to be in that place and have some answers to why that place is specific and connected to other places in ways that other places are not, right? So to do that. So in order to land on Earth in this new climate regime, I think it's important to take seriously where we land. And so let's go to Los Angeles. Los Angeles is defined above all by its relationship to water. So Los Angeles is the largest landholder in Inyo County, which is the second largest county in California. Now, it's a city of 4 million people. So Los Angeles, the city, is 4 million people, but it is one of 89 cities in the county of Los Angeles. And the county has about 10 million people in it. And if you include the entire metro area, Los Angeles is one of 5 counties. It's about 18.5 million. I often say that it's about the size of size and population of Holland, but with considerably worse public transportation. But it's also, this comparison is something that comes up over and over again, such as in 1938 in this great book by Anton Wagner about Los Angeles, where he superimposes Los Angeles, Berlin, and the Rheinhessen as a way of showing what the relative sizes of these places are, right? So Los Angeles is an enormous, sprawling place that is urban throughout, right? And so it's concreted in. It hasn't always been that way, and it has developed very rapidly into that, but that's one of the things that makes it specific. But Los Angeles is not actually in Inyo County, which is where I started. So why did I mention Inyo County? Well, because the water for Los Angeles does not come from Los Angeles, and it does not come from anywhere near Los Angeles. In fact, it comes from 3 different sources quite a long distance away from Los Angeles. Well, 4 if you count the sky, which only happens for about 2 months during the year and generally just rolls out to sea when that happens. So we steal water from the Colorado River. We steal water from on the eastern side of the Sierra, but also on the western side of the Sierra through a really remarkable series of aqueducts. This is how we compare ourselves to Holland, is by our water engineering triumphs. And it is quite a triumph. It's a very long series of aqueducts that bring water into Los Angeles and have done since 1913. It's a famous story. If you've ever seen the movie Chinatown, it's a sort of parable of the bringing of water to Los Angeles. It basically what it does is it changes the ecologies of everything along that line from where the water is coming from. It drains and salinifies Mono Lake. It destroys Owens Lake in the Owens Valley and creates massive dust storms. So, and then in LA proper, there's a kind of terraforming that happens, which is that most of the things that grow in Los Angeles, when you go there, don't belong there, right? So you have palm trees and pine trees next to each other. You have massive lawns. You have all kinds of beautiful flowering plants that just wouldn't grow there without this constant importation of water. So it's a terraformed landscape in that sense. It's also got these famous concrete rivers, which you're inevitably going to see in a movie at some point, whether it's Point Blank with Lee Marvin or a Terminator film, where someone will drive through these empty rivers, concrete rivers, that were created for flood control, because the other side of watering in order to have water for human and plant growth is keeping it from overwhelming you as an urban place. And the floods, which come once a year, and there's a whole other story I could tell you about how Los Angeles is related to winds. The winds come, the fires come, then the floods come. It's a cyclical process that happens every year. But we built these concrete rivers, which then essentially channel that water and very, very quickly and very fast out into the Pacific Ocean. And so there's a lot of debate about what to do to do all this. Despite this madness, we actually use something like 25% less water now than we did 45 years ago. LA knows it has a water problem, and it's being, and it has various creative ways in which it's trying to. But that sense of the region is very important to what things live there and how they live there, how animals exist in the city along with humans. Of course, there's a revitalization plan for the river as well. But another way in which you can understand Los Angeles, and have to in this context, is through settlement, right? So when we have, this sort of, if there's one thing that sort of sounds off to me about the way in which we talk about the Modes of Existence project or the Latourian project, it's this often implicit claim about us and them, as if the places are if people are in different places or communities are in different places on Earth, and this is not true in a settler colonial context, right? In a settler colonial context, you have this incredible mixing of people. You also have a moment of colonization that started but never ended, right? We have the largest population of Native American people in Los Angeles, but actually a minuscule percentage of that are actually native to Los Angeles, right? They're from all over the US and Canada as well. And so there's a really mixed set of people. And when you think about sort of the development of dog or sneeze?
I think it's a sneeze.
Okay, all right,
But
good.
it's a very powerful
If it's a dog, they're welcome to join us. But if it's someone sneezing, they should stay in their room. When you look at the maps that develop over the and the way that people have thought about where landscapes are being invaded and requalified, you have a kind of long history here. This is a very palimpsestic place, right? Because you have Spanish, of course, you have multiple tribes, California tribes that come in 250 different nations in Southern California, and then you have Spanish colonization, and then you have Mexican independence, and then you have Anglo colonization, and then you have a kind of transformation of the city into a global city in the late 20th century. So it's a very palimpsestic place. I think it might be a dog. I'll slow down. Okay. So California, like all of the US, was extensively mapped as part of this colonial project. And so you can think of it as having a kind of hydrological and geological identity as well. But I like to think about settler colonialism as having a particular kind of ecological effect, right? Which is that when colonization happened, it was a kind of delegation, primarily to private parties, to remake the landscape in different ways, right? So you have ranching being brought in, you have cattle being brought in, then you have oil drilling, then you have orange groves, then you have development, right? All of these things are delegations to private citizens to transform the landscape. And that is one of the things that accounts for why LA looks the way it does. It's also developed into an administratively very complex place. Federal, state, and city, of course, right? But there's a kind of city-county relationship that's very important to California that is actually important enough that it's got a name, which is the Lakewood plan. Mike Davis writes about it in City of Courts. And essentially, so this is Los Angeles County, and the white part here is the city, and all the other colored parts are little cities. Some of those cities have all of their own services, like they will have a fire department or a police department or something. The others will contract with the county to have them do that for them. And then there are also what are called unincorporated areas, which are places that are neither city nor neither county nor city, but just sort of don't have an identity as a city, and so they're only sovereign, as it were, as the county. And this is complicated enough as it stands, but there's also thousands of districts and other kinds of things. There's a flood control district government. There's a business control district. There are joint powers everywhere. I learned recently that if you want to count it up, like California, and Southern California in particular, actually has about 3,500 governments, which is a lot of governments for any place, right? And so if you think about the complexity of that, it can be a little overwhelming if you expect there to be one, if you want your Leviathan, it's not going to happen here. And that was, complicated enough that Vincent Ostrom, who was one of the early neoliberals writing in the 20th century, coined the term polycentric to describe the kind of governance that happens in Los Angeles. So it's polycentric in its governmental. That's a lot. That's overlapping jurisdictions. It's not subsidiarity, but it's a strange overlapping set of jurisdictions. And I don't want to make too strong a case for exceptionalism here, except that the shape of LA is very strange to me. I think it looks a little bit like a digestive system, and if you map them, it's really remarkable. This is actually the port of LA where all of the ships from China come in, and this is the valley, which is reviled by everyone in Los Angeles. So, okay, but that's as exceptional as I'll get there. My research, of course, has been trying to find out how to interact with many of these people in this polycentric place. And so there's just a ton of different people. I started with pest control professionals, but I quickly met public health employees, tribal members, activists, government employees, right? And so as a practice, it's very difficult and challenging, but also a lot of fun to do that. And so that has ended up in a set of cosmograms about LA. And I'm really actually trying to draw each of these cosmograms, but I'm going to go through these quickly because each of these could be a talk in its own right, and I don't want to take up all the time. So we have to get to other stories about dogs. Okay, so let's start with the rat. One of the things that I learned about rats, and this is happy news for a group of people who might consider themselves science studies or Latourian actors, is that it starts with a black box. And when I first started going out with pest control people, I realized that what goes into this black box is very important. It's an anticoagulant rodenticide. And the reason an anticoagulant rodenticide is very important is because it was discovered quite randomly because a bunch of cows were dying in a place in Wisconsin, and a chemist figured out that what was happening was that it was causing them to bleed out. Their blood was too thin, and it was killing them. And he realized that this was a really wonderful possible chemical for treating blood clots and strokes, right? And developed the first drug called warfarin for treating this. And at the same time, also realized, because he was killing a lot of rats in order to find this out, that it was a really excellent rat poison. And so developed both the drug warfarin and the rat poison warfarin. And so it's one of these, I don't know if this is a metamorphosis moment right here, but this is one of those places where humans are taking it, and it's an important thing to keep humans from having strokes, and rats are taking it and it's killing them. Now, it's also, because of the black box that I showed you, related to a question of taste aversion or what's sometimes called bait shyness. And so the method we've developed for killing rats is tuned to what rats are, chemically and physically, right? And so this chemical, this is part of the sort of agencies of the rat. One of the agencies of the rat is that it's very neophobic. It doesn't like new things. If it eats a little bit of something and it makes it sick, it won't touch it again ever, right? So it has a really good memory for that. So what's great about what's great and horrifying about an anticoagulant rodenticide is that the rat can eat a little bit but doesn't get sick, and then eat a little bit more but doesn't get sick, and then eat a little bit more but doesn't get sick, and then die, right? And so it's tuned to the physiology of the rat, and that's what goes into the bait station. And the bait station itself is also tuned to the rat, and it was created in World War II and designed around the rat body. So you put the poison in it, but what you have to worry about is that you don't want anything else to be poisoned. You don't want your children eating it, you don't want your cats eating it, and you can't just throw warfarin on the ground wherever you're going to kill rats, right? So you have to create something which is specific to the rat body. The rat-specific qualities of the container were very important to the bait station. So the station, the poison, the bait, all tuned to trying to kill rats. All of this comes together in a very strange and remarkable story, which is that the person who created that bait station was none other than Charles Elton. So we've already had Darwin in the room this morning. I'll bring Elton in if you don't know him. He's the second most famous in this respect. He's the ecologist who's responsible for coining the term niche and for doing a lot of the work to establish scientific ecology in the 1930s. His Bureau of Animal Population was famous for pioneering a number of things in ecology, and he converted that to a rat control program during World War II, during which he did many of these tests to try and figure out what rats eat, how they eat, what they're afraid of, what neophobia is, and how they go into bait stations and whatnot. He's also the author of The Ecology of Invasions, which is the book that launched the scientific field of invasive biology, the understanding of where invasive and native animals are, and how dynamics, population fluctuations of invasion work, right? So rat control is an agricultural problem, it's a health control problem, but it also turns out it's a problem of conserving entities on islands, right? And all of these three things come together in Charles Elton, and I think it's so I've written a paper about that. And we created a very effective poison then. We spread it around the world. I do a game that I could have shown you here, which is basically I can go almost anywhere in the world and within 5 minutes find a rodent bait station. I'll show you one outside if you want, because we've scaled this up to be everywhere in the world. The downside, of course, is that eventually we realized that it was not only killing rats, but it had a secondary effect. So when the rats eat a little, and then wander off, sometimes they're killed by a hawk or an owl. Sometimes they're eaten by a coyote or fox, and the poison accumulates. And so the secondary effects of the poison are moving up the food chain. And in California, pretty much any mammal in that food chain has anticoagulant rodenticide in it at this point, right? Because we use so much of it that it's spread throughout the entire food chain. So in 2020, the California legislature decided that they were going to ban this poison, get rid of it, which they did, and it was successful in some ways. But one of the things that I realized about this infrastructure and the way that we govern rats is that because of this bait station and its infrastructure and its ubiquity, it's very easy for people to just put some other poison in the box, right? The infrastructure is there. If you ban anticoagulant rodenticide, great, let's put something else in there like bromethalin, which is a neurotoxin and arguably worse than the AR, right? So this is a part of a larger project which sends me all over the world trying to look for rats and rat stories. Here I am at the Getty Institute in their beautiful gardens trying to get at a rodent bait station which is disguised as a rock. So it's really a ubiquitous problem all around the world. So the rat is one kind of cosmogram of how different agencies, mostly pest control professionals, but also the Department of Pesticide Regulation and a variety of other agencies, come to govern how rats are dealt with in the city. Okay, the coyote is a different story. The coyote is a very important part of Los Angeles' imaginary and the imaginary in the West. The coyote is the trickster. The coyote has many stories in Native American and settler history. Coyotes are everywhere in the city, not just at the edges, but in the most concrete of concrete Los Angeles, you can find coyotes. One of our favorite excursions involved finding a set of coyotes in the Boyle Heights Cemetery, which is right next to downtown Los Angeles. And coyotes are mainly an issue and turned into an issue. They appear to agencies in Los Angeles because they eat pets. They eat cats and they eat small dogs. And this causes an immense amount of controversy because you have people in the city who haven't really thought about coyotes, losing their pet to a coyote, and the kinds of emotions and anger and frustration that emerge are kind of predictable. One of the places you can see that and one of the places that we've studied it is on social media. So in particular, a tool called Nextdoor, which is a hellscape created in order for neighbors to talk to each other about what's going on in their neighborhood, right? It's confined to a particular location, to a neighborhood, and people talk to each other. One of the things they do a lot on Nextdoor is talk about coyotes, right? And someone will say, I saw a coyote. And someone else will say, I saw that coyote, and then they'll talk about the coyote and what should we do about it. This has led to the creation of a number of practices to address coyote agencies. So the most prominent of them is called hazing. And the idea here is that when you see a coyote and you don't want it in your area, you make yourself large, you have a can full of rocks or something, you throw something at the coyote, you basically demonstrate that you're an apex predator of some sort, right? Now this we find totally fascinating because it's a semiotic mystery. No one knows what the coyote is thinking, obviously, and it's quite possible that the coyote thinks that you're playing and is just or maybe the coyote is just bored with your actions, right? There's very little sort of scientific evidence here, but it fits into something that makes people feel like they're engaging with the coyote and they're doing something about it. And this is oddly a way of saying we should coexist with coyotes, right? We should, and it makes a certain amount of sense because the alternative is often to send someone out to try and kill them, right? And so the alternative is we want to live with them, but we don't want them near us, right? Which has shades of settlement and and containment under settler colonialism, right? Like, yes, please stay, but here's a reservation, right? That kind of logic, right? What we realized is that actually one of the key mechanisms that's happening here is not actually the physiology or the biology of the coyote, but something that we dubbed the cloud coyote. And the cloud coyote is what happens when you have people, one person sees a coyote and then another person responds to that person. And this is where you see the intense polarization online happening, but not only online. This is just a sign that we saw where someone had written this, like, let's get the coyotes out of here. And then someone else wrote, they were here first, right? So a debate about whether the coyotes belong or not. But these are not real coyotes. These are cloud coyotes, right? They're coyotes that move through, in a semiotic sense, in a very Peircean sense, through social media, on and off of social media, into other places, and become very fearsome. They become much more threatening than real coyotes, much more dangerous, right? And they cause action in places like city councils. So the Torrance City Council at one point was taken over by a kind of, and the red shirts are not an accident here, a MAGA politician who ran on the platform of controlling coyotes in the city and invited just hundreds of people to come in and tell their personal stories about having lost a pet to a coyote, and then managed to win a seat on the city council and eventually became mayor of Torrance, which is one of those small cities I was telling you about before. So don't worry, it's not bad. but worry a little. This is a coyote backpack with a tiny pet in its mouth. So we invented this species called the cloud coyote. And a cloud coyote is easy to distinguish. So here's that coyote again. That's a picture we took of a coyote. This is a cloud coyote, right? This is a LA Times article about our research, right? And this is how the coyote turns into the cloud coyote, becomes a kind of semiotic operator in that sense. Okay, so that's coyotes. Cats, everyone's favorite. Cats we got interested in because coyotes eat them. And we were wondering, why are there so many cats available for the coyotes? Why is there seem to be apparently a cat buffet for coyotes everywhere? And one of the answers is that because there are about 500,000 feral cats living in Los Angeles. And they're living in small colonies, they're roaming freely, they exist in lots of forms. My colleague Jessica Lynch and I got interested in what is it exactly that makes the domestic cat so successful as a companion species, because it's not easy to figure out. These are all wild cats, right? These are not domestic cats. They all look very similar, and in fact, biologically, they're almost indistinguishable. In fact, the IUCN definition of the domestic cat says, we really can't tell the difference between wild cats and domestic cats, but we have to make a separation because otherwise we have a political problem, right? And it's a really nice example of how IUCN recognizes its own political designation of species, right? So house cats are everywhere in the world. They expand their niche in lots of ways. One of the things we realized is just the way in which cats have the capacity to go back and forth between a feral docile spectrum. Sometimes they go out and they live on their own. Sometimes they're happy being inside with you. And there's a lot of debate and contestation about when this happens and to which cats and why, whether they have to be socialized early or whether they can do that at any point in their life, whether it's a species phenomenon or a individual phenomenon. There's a lot of scientific debate about it. And our kind of, our interest in this is about niche expansion, and I can say more about this if you're interested. It's an attempt to figure out exactly what's going on with cat-human kinship, as it were. But the interesting part here is that what cats do when they're out in the wild is they're of course very cute, and they're fed by lots of people, and people love them. But they also kill a lot of songbirds. And this angered a lot of environmentalists who recognized that at a certain point, the city was not only not doing anything about this, not preventing cats from killing birds, but actually facilitating it. And they were doing that through a technique called trap, neuter, return. So private organizations go out and trap cats, neuter or spay them, and then return them to the city under the theory that if you spay and neuter them, the population will decline, right? The environmentalists said, this doesn't work, you can't do that, and brought a lawsuit. And the lawsuit basically stopped the city from doing anything until they did an environmental impact report about whether or not spaying and neutering cats had an impact on the environment. There's a ridiculousness to this story. But what it produced was what I refer to as the cutest environmental impact report ever. 600 pages of information about cats and their reproductive behaviors, all organized around the question of whether or not, when you do this practice of trap, neuter, return, are you causing more damage than if you don't? There's a long story to it. There's a really interesting, very technical story of a model right at the center of it. I have papers about all of this. The thing that was, I think, most interesting about this was that the pre-existing condition that forms the baseline for any kind of environmental quality analysis is sort of the baseline on this, which is this is tested. The city recognized that these cats were killing birds and causing disease. They just said, well, it doesn't matter because we won't make it any worse if we do this, right? Which is kind of one of the limited governmental agencies under environmental law that we're also interested in. Okay, one last thing about cats, which is that if you think a little bit about the different ways in which animals are governed in urban settings and non-urban settings, you can think about three large areas in which this kind of governance happens. So you've got public health and zoonotic emergence concerns, right? So you've got bats, right? A big, huge concern in this context, right? You have pigs and chickens and whatnot. You have biodiversity and invasive species concerns, right? So which fish are going extinct and which ones need to be protected, et cetera. And then you have animal welfare and rescue, right? The people who are concerned with taking care of seals and polar bears and the kind of more public-facing part of this, right? Right in the center of it, of all of this, is the cat, right? The cat is the creature that is very clearly in all three of those domains. Now, what I think is interesting is if you turn this diagram on its side, as it were, you recognize that one of these three areas is really, as it were, landing on Earth, right? So the zoonotic disease people, it's all World Health Organization, Centers for Disease Control. We saw it evolved under COVID, right? What it looks like for that kind of governance structure to be responsible and responsive. The same for biodiversity and invasive species. It's a global process. The IUCN, the Red List, all of that happens. Animal welfare organizations tend to be networked and dispersed in particular places like California and very close to the ground. And so in terms of cats, the animal welfare people are really the ones having the most impact and with the most political power vis-a-vis this question of whether or not cats kill birds. And so it was really not, I mean, in some ways not surprising, but a diagnosis of what's going on there is that the ones that are, the people that are landing closer to Earth on this problem are having more political effects on that. And so the people protecting birds were bringing all of these international organizations and concerns to bear on the question, but failing to stop it from happening. And so I thought that was an interesting outcome. How much time do I have? Okay. I might skip wetland. I'll just mention it very briefly, which is that there's a wetland in South LA that we study called the Los Cerritos wetland, which is interesting because it's a site of oil drilling. LA is and was one of the largest oil fields in the world for much of the 20th century. And now there's a plan to restore that wetlands to its original form. If anyone in here studies restoration or thinks about restoration, this is a classic problem of where the baseline is, what to restore it to and whatnot. The problem with this wetland is that it's also directly on the site of a sacred Tongva and Ahachiman, a sacred site for the Tongva and the Ahachiman tribes in the city. In particular, the birthplace of an entity called Chinigchinish, documented by one of the early, really only documented clearly by one of the early Spanish missionaries. Many of the other stories have been, the genocide in Southern California was almost complete, so there's haphazard records of these things. So it's a very contested religious site as well as a political site, and on top of that has a kind of complex mitigation banking structure that involves these environmental intangibles that are necessary for creating this, the fungible environment that you can save, right? So the wetlands case is a very interesting one that helps us get into that notion of where and how settler colonialism works in this context. Okay, so let me just come back to this then question of mode or super existence and think a little bit about this with you and ask for your help in what is actually, I agree, John, a really lovely phrase, multimodal composition of super existences. So if we return to the question of what I'm calling the administrative state, but which I think should be clear to you also includes all kinds of other organizations, private organizations, people who are acting as delegates of the administration, etc. Then it's clear that there's sort of multiple modes of existence mingling and combining here. Rats, rat poison, neophobia, human horror, all kind of mingled together around the problem of the rat. Cat reproduction, environmentalists, birds, biodiversity, etc. Wetlands and indigenous sovereignty. So I guess the question really is this best understood as a particular mode of existence or as a composition of superexistences? And if it's the latter, an interesting question I think is who's the diplomat in this case, right? Who plays the diplomat to this? So you could phrase it, you could pose it as an alternative here, is to think about, okay, so maybe it's the composition of superexistences when the scientists and the public participation and the tribal representatives and the moralists all work together to figure out what to do about rats or cats. Then do they produce something superexistent there, or are they just clashing with each other in different modes in that context? But you could also maybe propose another mode of existence here, which I think is actually kind of interesting to me, which is to say I would label it commensal, which is just to say in any moment when you're encountering an animal or where the question really is eat or be eaten, right? You have this kind of very important moment of having to respond, right? And that eat or be eaten can be a direct thing, like the bear will eat you or you will kill the bear, right? But it can also be what the rats represent in the same context, which is that we don't want the rats because they eat our food, right? And so the eating part of it to me is very important. Eat or be eaten, the metabolic part, and even as part of that. And one might think a little bit about what those felicity conditions are too, again, in terms of how it is that we are going to acknowledge the contestation of animals, right? When the rat or the coyote or the cat contests what we're doing, or the bird contests what the cat is doing, how do we recognize it, right? What are going to be the ways in which we decide the felicity conditions of that being true? Or which beings do we need in order to do this, right? Do we have substandard beings within our administrative state that are incapable of doing this? Do we need to create new ones? Or is it a question of reorganizing them in some way? And this question of the diplomat is important to me because I find myself, as the anthropologist, the compositor in some cases, often in this setting, talking to people across multiple modes of existence, right? So talking to the pest control people who ask me, what do the scientists say? And talking to the scientists who don't know that the pest control people know something about the animals, and talking to the public health people who say, why don't people believe this? And so on and so forth, right? And so I find myself in this translation position quite often as a result of being a Latourian, I think, so. Okay, I'll stop there because eventually we're going to have to move on to talking about dogs. I guess we're going to switch the order, but thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Est-ce qu'il y a des réactions, des questions, questions, reactions in English and French? Monsieur.
Can you show the last interview with the super existences?
This one?
On the left side and on the right?
Yeah.
I mean, it appears to me that you also, that you do not have to necessarily kind of bring them into contradiction or whatever.
Yeah.
So you can just level them off.
Yeah.
One is on another level and the other one.
Yeah. In general.
So the categories can look very different.
Yeah.
At a particular level, and at the level above they are completely have another organization.
Yeah. And I don't think these are necessarily mutually exclusive in that sense. One could multiply the modes of existence, in different, but also still have super existences emerging or failing to emerge. So yeah, I don't want to suggest that it's mutually exclusive, but I'm also not an expert in manipulating this language. So I can't ref met with the best of them.
I think you're the person who put very discreetly much more of the modes of existences into your talk than anyone else. If you think we didn't see the little left part of
I'm trying.
changing at the end of your quotations.
Yeah. Yeah.
John first, and then Stefan.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. That was fantastic. Such fascinating set of field sites that you're coordinating.
Yeah.
So there's a way in which multi-site anthropology is really relevant as a way to test the complexity of the inquiry into
Yeah.
modes of existence. And you've shown that. I think that's why you had to bring
Yeah.
all the modes
Yeah.
in a way that hasn't been the case with such a complex or
Yeah.
field site. I also think your last point at the end, I don't think we resolved it yesterday.
Uh-huh.
Where does diplomacy fit within the
Yeah.
inquiry?
Mm-hmm.
Is it outside the inquiry?
Yeah.
And can't be incorporated? Is it a particular mode
Mm-hmm.
that has to be incorporated for it
Mhm.
to work? And I think the reason why I suggest the latter is shown by what your site, which
Mhm.
is that we're never inside the West
Mm-hmm.
in
Right.
any kind of pure form.
Right.
So this fictional project of
Mhm.
describing the modes that are relevant for the West and then would be
Mhm.
presented diplomatically to the rest of the world
Mm-hmm.
is a complete fiction in the bad sense.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
That's not how the world currently
Yeah.
is, arguably never was.
Yeah.
We were never Western,
Right.
just as we were never
Right.
modern. So I think in order for the system to be defined in a way that actually applies to reality, diplomacy has to be part of it.
Yeah.
It can't be outside of it.
Yeah.
And then a question to you is, how do you think about the difference of the modes when they are brought by figures who are outside of the system as
Mhm.
who have presented it?
Yeah.
For example, the Tonga,
Yeah.
right, the tribal representatives. Do you want to assimilate them into one of the 15 modes?
Yeah.
Or do they have their own modes? Or
Yeah.
even more so,
Yes.
if you think about the cats or the coyotes or the water.
Yeah.
You seem to, there's a kind of book school,
Mm-hmm.
animal
Yep.
worlds here.
Yep.
Do animals have their own modes? Is the
Yeah.
coyote mode different than a cat mode? Is that part of what you're trying to
Yeah.
define? What are the felicity conditions
Uh-huh.
for Felix,
Yeah.
for a cat?
Yeah.
So how do you think about them as these radically non-Western others
Right.
as being incorporated into either the tourist system or
Yeah.
your system?
Yeah.
What kind of modes do they do?
Yeah. I want to answer the question about thinking about, for instance, the Tongva or the Hachiman participating, or many of the modes in which Native Americans in California do participate in this arrangement, because there are multiple ways in which they do. And so there is the highly politicized and most spectacular version of it, which is the kind of decolonization is not a metaphor, right? Like, there is no other answer than giving us our land back, right? But that's always kind of there and present in the decolonization language. But when you look at, for instance, it's especially clear in Northern California with forest and river management, you look at the people who are members of native tribes participating with the forest department to do experiments on how to restore a river, or whether or not controlled fire improves an ecology. And you really see a mixing there. You really see people engaging in multiple modes of existence at once. And so both of those things are going on in California, and I think the ones that are mixing are often more effective than the ones that are sticking within a single mode, as it were. Now, with animals, the same problem kind of emerges, but I think, and this is why maybe it's really got its own mode of existence, right, is that there is just this question of kind of inventing a language for participating with the animals, right, or recognizing. So much of what we do as humans is just project onto these animals, and we do that, I think, in each of these modes, each of the existing modes differently. The scientists project a certain kind of thing onto them. The religious mode projects a third kind of, right? And so the sort of, that's why the eat or be eaten moment is so important, right? Is that there's a kind of, like a real moment of threat or of existential threat that has to come into being for you to want to develop a form of communication that allows you to see what an animal or a set of animals wants. And I think a lot of different people in animal management, animal governance, animal welfare have different languages for this. Sometimes they're very moralistic. The most common, of course, is suffering, which we inherit from Bentham, right? All animals suffer, and therefore that's a reason why we should give them rights and understand them as such, right? So that's one mode of saying, you know, we are going to invent ways to make sense of and see their suffering so that that becomes a politically important moment, right? Scientists like to demonstrate their craftiness, right? That they can do things that humans say they can't. They have language, they have tool use, they have, you know, so often this is the scientist's route towards trying to create capacities is actually to remove those claims that they can't do something and say, here's evidence that they can, what would you do with that, right? So I think that happens in multiple different domains. Lawyers and the legal system obviously have an incredibly rich way of trying to do this. Going back to the famous rats of Autun, who were represented here not here, but in France as judicial subjects, right? They didn't show up to court, so therefore the judge decided in their favor that the case against them could be dropped. So it happens in lots of different ways, and I think people invent those constantly.
Just a very quick question, and thank you very much for your talk. In which way can we say that animals are political?
Yeah.
If you go further into the presentation, which was the previous question.
Yeah.
Question actually.
I think my approach to this really is to think about is to keep governance and contestation in tension, right? It's to say it is clearly the case that animals are governed. There is no question about all the different ways in which animals are governed. But one definition of the political is the ability to contest that, right? And the modes by which we do that. So you think about a kind of Rancière or Chantal Mouffe definition of dissensus, right? That you can contest and argue about the ways in which you're being governed with the aim of changing that, with the aim of reforming it or causing revolution or whatever, right? So if you don't have that moment there for animals, then it's just a carceral form of governance, right? But if you do have that there, then you open up the system as it exists to a set of questions which are true not only of animals but of humans, right? So if it's political, and if you can think about it being political in that sense of allowing contestation, if we could learn more about how it works, we might have better ways of talking about why our own governance of humans fails in so many ways, right? So that's kind of my intuition about that. And it's probably more Foucauldian than Latourian in that sense, right? Because I'm really very interested in the way that animals are made into political subjects through governance, right? And that moment has to be something where, you know, the strictest definition would require the animal to recognize that institutions existed and that it could contest them. That would be the strictest definition, right? And people really argue that therefore that can't happen. But I can see with a kind of Latourian lens on that you could have a different definition of contestation and of the recognition of that contestation amongst animals. So.
There is maybe a last question by Stefan,
Yes, a very
and then we'll have
quick
to
question. Yes.
close.
Thank you very much for the overview talk. It's very inspiring and helps a lot also for the CFR program. I would like you to come back a little bit more about this politics of the governance. You started to answer about the Foucauldian state, but do you think, how do you see the parallel between the parallel stories, so to speak, between the governing invasive species, for instance, and governing migrants in LA? And also the idea of animal citizenship, which is also from some groups are really central.
I mean, there's probably a very long answer to this when we can talk about it. But the short answer, I think, is that there are versions of this that start from the presumptions of liberal governance, and that's like the citizenship one, right? Is that citizenship is a valuable thing. What forms of citizenship can we give to animals, right? I think the Latourian mode would ask us to say, okay, maybe we don't start with citizenship. Maybe we start with something that just better describes what it means for animals and humans to live in community and try to generate a practice that actually allows that to happen, right? And it doesn't fit necessarily into the liberal governmental regimes, which makes it very hard to say, let's do that, right? So we have this challenge of a very complex system in place that we have to either reform or blow up, I guess, which is not really an option, but a set of imaginations that are much larger than what that system allows right now. So that's where we're stuck.
Thank you very much.